Hi, in this session we'll talk about what is SQL. It's a language through which we can interact with RDBMS. So now you know what an RDBMS is, you know what COTS rules are. One of the COTS rule is every RDBMS should support a high level language called as SQL. So using this SQL language, you should be able to create different kind of an objects in your database. So in a database we can create tables through which we can store the data. We can also create views. This is also an object in every RDBMS through which we can hide some data or we can derive some more data what business wants. So we'll talk more about views later. So at least you need to be aware of in a database you will create different kind of an objects. So how do I create it? We use the SQL language to create these objects. So the next one is how we manipulate the data. So 90% of the time when you are running your operations, you will be doing changes to the database or changes to the table, changes to the existing customer information, or we can add new customer information, we can add product information, etc. So we keep manipulating the data all the time when we are running the business. And then the last one is we control the security. So we want to grant the permission to only the applicable users who can use the system. So and SQL, from when it comes to the SQL, this is the only language which programmers use to interact with RDBMS while they are manipulating the data. So there is no other common language through which we can interact with any other, with any RDBMS. So no matter what language you are using to build an application front end, so you guys know what a front end is, you know what a back end is. We already talked about what an application is. So no matter what language you are going to use, it can be Java, it can be .NET, it can be C#, it can be C++, it can be Visual Basic. No matter what application language you are going to use, you are going to embed a language called as an SQL in order to interact with your database. So without SQL, we won't be able to interact with your RDBMS at all. So to recollect all that, we should be able to create objects, we should be able to manipulate the data what we have, and you can control the security. So that brings up the types of SQL statements what we have. So the types of SQL statements we have is three different types. One is data definition language. So the next one is data manipulation language, and the last one is data control language. So what is data definition language? So using this language, we will be able to create the different kinds of objects in your database. So now we will just talk about what are all the different types of objects. So we talked about tables and views. Now we also, there is an object called as a sequence through which we can generate a the running numbers in your database, in your Oracle RDBMS. So that is also another object. So you can create indexes in order to retrieve the data faster. So to create any kind of an object in your RDBMS, we use the data definition language. Similarly, if you want to drop the object, say, I have an index on a particular table, and then the index is not being used at all, or I have a view which a specific business community was using to access their relevant data, but right now that business community doesn't exist or the business function doesn't exist, then I can drop the object which we already have it in our database. So I can drop a table, we can drop a view or a sequence or an index object, etc. So then we can also modify the objects. Say currently we have only 5 different columns in employee table: employee number, employee name, you can talk about the date of join, but somehow we forgot to include date of birth column in your employee table. So right now business wants date of birth column into the table, so we need to alter the table what we already created. So that also you create, you use data definition language. So how do I define it in one sentence? Data definition language is part of SQL through which you will create or drop or alter the objects which already existing. So if you change the structure of the database as such, if then that becomes the data definition language. So when we go ahead and create a database, we have to create bunch of tables through which we are going to maintain the data. So the first thing which will come after the design is you create this physical structure on your database. So in that scenario, we go for data definition language. So what is data manipulation language? So manipulating the data what we already have in our database is called as data manipulation language. Usually we call it as DML statements. So what are, consider there is a table called as an employee. So what different things you can do it on an employee table? You can go ahead and add a new employee into the table, or when there is a change happens to an employee's salary, so we may change the data with respect to that employee in the table. Then if an employee leaves the organization, then you can go ahead and remove that particular record. Or if someone wants to see what is the job role of employee Tim, then you can pretty much select the information what we already have. So there are only 4 things you can do. One is you can view the information. So how do I view the information from the database? We issue a language, we issue a select statement. So select is a data manipulation language through which we can view the existing information. We can change the data or modify the data. So what does it really mean? We can just go ahead and cancel the existing flight ticket what we have. So if you see what are all the cancellations I already booked a ticket, but I want to cancel it. So all they have to do is change the status of that particular flight ticket from booked to cancelled. So we change the existing data. So what does delete really mean? So in an airline business, there is a particular route. That route is not giving enough revenue back to the company, so they decided to remove the existing route to save the cost. So in that scenario, already I am serving 25 routes in which I want to remove one of the route. Then we can go ahead and use the delete statement. Then you can add data. So what is add data? You insert new sets of data to the database. So here adding new flight information to a new route. So first you create a new route, then you create a new flight, and you give the information about the flight and associate that to the route. So basically you keep adding data so that from tomorrow that flight gets take off, or from tomorrow you can start booking the tickets against that flight. Then finally the data control language. So what does this data control language do? It's, as we talked about, it provides the security mechanism for us to give access to the relevant people to the relevant data. So we have grant permission, granting permission to insert data in an employee table to bill. So this is a business requirement. Bill should be able to insert record into employee table. So then we grant permission to bill on employee table so that he can insert the data. Similarly, if bill moved to a different department, you should not be able to insert into the table anymore. Then we can revoke the permission of insert from bill on employee table. So to kind of recollect whatever we talked about, an SQL is a language through which we maintain the database as well as the data within your database. So there are 3 types of SQL statements: data definition language, data manipulation language, and data control language. Thanks.